Questions without notice. Oh, sorry, I should have said in accordance with Standing Order 43 that time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. When 8,000 Telstra workers lost their job today, the Minister for Urban Infrastructure shrugged his shoulders and said, "As a former telco executive, I can say these things do happen from time to time." Yesterday, the Prime Minister told a 60-year-old aged care worker in Burnie to get a better job. Doesn't this reveal everything the Prime Minister stands for?
On my right.
Tax cuts for executives, cheap insults for Australian workers.
The Prime Minister.
That question demonstrates everything you need to know about the Leader of the Opposition. He cannot tell the truth. He cannot tell the truth. It's only 24 hours, and he's already misleading the House about what I said to the House. And what about the slimy, patronising insinuation he made about 60-year-old Australians? What about that? What about that? Apparently, according to him, if you're 60 years of age, you've got to stay in the same job forever, earn the same money forever.
The member for Morton is warned.
You can't. Let's say you're a 60-year-old registered nurse working in aged care. I'm sure there's many of that age in that industry. You can't aspire to become a manager. You can't aspire to earn more. What if you're a personal care attendant? Oh, if you're 60, you can't aspire to train and become an enrolled nurse or a registered nurse. What this tells you again is the smug, slimy insinuations the Labor Party make about the aspirations of Australians. We believe in their aspirations. We know that every Australian is entitled to do everything they can to realise their dream, to aspire, to go to work, to train, to earn more money, to move from one job to another, to move from one department to another. It's their lives. They should be able to manage their lives as they wish. Our job, we believe, is that government's role is to enable Australians to do their best. You've just heard from this slimy, insinuating, patronising Leader of the Opposition that they believe that 60-year-old workers should stay in their place. That's what you believe. You don't believe 60 is the new 40. You believe 60 is frozen in time. It's very significant they referred to a 60-year-old because the insinuation there was, that's it, you can't do anything else, you can't earn anything more. Well, let me tell you, I've been 60 and I know, I'm over 60. 60-year-olds have got plenty of energy, plenty of ambition, and there's a lot of them, and they're going to come after you at the next election.
Members on both sides will cease interjecting. The member for Parramatta is warned. The member for Morton and Cowan have already been warned. The member for Chisholm can just resume her seat for a second. Not only is the level of interjections far too high, and I'm not going to keep repeating myself, I'll simply take action, a practice has developed on my right where there's constant banging of the desks. Can I say the practice is very clear on this matter? The practice is very clear on this matter, and Speaker Andrew addressed it back in 1997. Constant banging on the desks is not acceptable conduct in the chamber. The member for Chisholm has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the government's plan for lower taxes encourages and rewards enterprise and aspiration, including in my electorate of Chisholm? Would the Prime Minister be mystified by an alternative approach?
The Prime Minister has the call.
None of us here are mystified by the aspiration-denying smugness of the Labor Party. None of us. We know the Labor Party has given up on Australian workers. The old Labor leaders of the past, my old mate Neville Rand, would have been disgusted to hear from the member for Sydney yesterday saying aspiration was a mystery to her. Well, I tell you what, it wasn't a mystery to Neville Rand or Bob Hawke or Paul Keating. They understood that their job was to enable workers to get ahead. But now we hear from this smug, insinuating character they want workers to stay in their place. Now, this is what we're doing. We have a tax plan in the Senate, which we will, if it comes back here with the amendment, we'll send it straight back because we want all Australians to get the benefit of a comprehensive tax reform. We want to ensure that 94% of Australians don't have to pay more than 32.5 cents for every extra dollar they earn. We want to reward and encourage aspiration. And, Mr Speaker, you would think the Labor Party was a complete dead loss, but there are glimmers of hope. The member for Corio today told Neil Mitchell 3 things. He said he could well be expelled for this. All Australians should pay less tax, he said. All Australians should pay less tax. He also said that people earning $125,000 a year are not millionaires. And he said that bracket creep was a problem that should be looked at. Well, Mr Speaker, the Treasurer is saying we always knew he wasn't such a bad bloke. And Mr Speaker, there's always the opportunity for him when the bill comes back from the Senate to vote like he did the last time and vote for the full package of reform. Mr Speaker, aspiration is what is driving the Australian economy. It is aspiration, the desire of Australians to get ahead, to do better for their families, to ensure that their kids have got greater opportunities than they had, to ensure that their businesses do well. The Labor Party sneers because they are smug in their big taxpayer-funded salaries. Well, let me tell you, in the real world, 90% of Australians work for the private sector, and they want to be encouraged, they want to be supported. Aspiration isn't a mystery to them, it's what drives our nation.
The member for might actually help if there weren't members standing in the chamber. The member for Lyons has the floor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, this Prime Minister told a 60-year-old aged care worker in Burnie to get a better job. Is this sort of snobbery the reason this Prime Minister is giving a millionaire investment banker a tax cut of $7,000 and an aged care worker a tax cut of just $10 a week?
Just before I call the Prime Minister, the member for Goldstein's been warned on a number of occasions he was interjecting right through the question. He'll leave under 94A. The Prime Minister has the call. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. Well, Mr Speaker, the member for Lyons is no more truthful in his recounting of yesterday's question time than his leader. And I'm disappointed that he has shown that he is of the same character as the leader of the opposition. Here are the facts. The Labor Party is patronising 60-year-old workers. It is patronising people who work in the aged care sector. It is patronising them, and it talks about millionaires getting $7,000 tax cuts. Well, you know what? Under our tax plan, the honourable member will get a $7,000 tax cut. He does. He will.
The member for Lyons.
He could always give it back. He could always give it back. He will give it back. The Minister for Revenue has her receipt book at the ready. The Labor Party has betrayed and abandoned the people, the aspiring workers that Labor was founded to defend. They have abandoned them. This is modern Labor. It is a disgrace. It's an embarrassment. If aspiration is a mystery to the modern Labor Party, I tell you what, it's not a mystery to millions of Australians who want to get ahead and know that only a strong economy will enable them to do that.
The member for Mackellar has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer update the House on why it's important to have a comprehensive plan for lower, simpler and fairer taxes, and how this will help aspirational Australians, including in my electorate of Mackellar?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mackellar for his question. He knows that the personal tax plan that we put in this year's budget will ensure that all working Australians get the benefit of tax relief. That's what our tax plan is designed to do. Some 70,000 in the member's own electorate, which is replicated all around members around this chamber. All working Australians, Mr Speaker, under our tax plan will benefit from tax relief. Now, of course, this tax relief starts, most importantly, with supporting low to middle income earners. That's where the first priority is. But as we know, our tax plan then goes on to deal with genuine and real problems in the tax system over the period of the plan. Now, there's a key difference when it comes to what we're doing on tax and what the Labor Party are doing. Our tax plan does not rely on taxing other Australians higher, Mr Speaker. Our tax plan does not seek to pit one group of Australians against another group of Australians. What our tax plan does is benefit all working Australians, Mr Speaker. It doesn't depend on ramping up taxes on some people and seeking to demonise some people. What it does, Mr Speaker, is recognise that all Australians work hard, all Australians are making a stronger economy in this place, in Australia, and all Australians deserve to benefit from that tax relief. So, having started with low to middle income earners, we move on to deal with the issues of bracket creep and lower taxes that the member for Corio, I'm glad to hear, enjoys that same view. I've found my long-lost twin, perhaps, on the other side, Mr Speaker. He shares these views so much. I welcome him to come and join us on this side. There's no butter knives over here for you to have to worry about. Mr Speaker, what's important is that our plan delivers for all Australians. It's not about creating winners and losers. The Leader of the Opposition's entire approach is all designed to try and set Australians against each other by creating winners and losers when it comes to tax. He wants to tax some more, he wants to rip into their pockets, and let's think about whose pockets he's ripping into. Is he ripping in to big multinationals? No, they voted against multinational tax reform, Mr Speaker. Is he ripping into big corporates? No, Mr Speaker, he's ripping into the pockets of retirees. He's ripping into the pockets of retirees and pensioners, and he's saying, I'm going to tax you $5 billion more every year.
Member for Wills is warned.
And, Mr Speaker, he's going to say that that is what he needs to do in order to do things in relation to tax in this country. Now, we don't need to do that. Our tax plans are designed to lower taxes for everyone, Mr Speaker, who works in this country. The Labor Party is the enemy of aspiration.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that this government has previously told Australians to get ahead, to get rich parents, or to get out of town, and just yesterday told a 60-year-old aged care worker to get a better job? Is this sort of snobbery why the Prime Minister is giving an investment banker a tax cut of $7,000 a year and an aged care worker a tax cut of $10 a week? Just how arrogant and out of touch can this Prime Minister get?
Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Again, nothing better sums up the character of the modern Labor Party than the dishonest question just asked by the honourable member.
Members on my left, the member for Wills has already been warned. The member for Kennedy.
Question to the Foreign Affairs Minister. I refer to articles on the front page of the Australian newspaper last Thursday and again on Saturday, centring on secret American Korean War Army files concerning Flying Officer Bruce Gillen and the other 42 missing Australians. In 1953, did the Australian government receive from its ally, the United States, a secret communique issued in September 1953 that named 9 Australian personnel as being alive and imprisoned in Korea? And did our government at the same time continue to aver that they had been killed in action? Bruce Gillen.
The Foreign Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Kennedy for his question. The Australian government, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone in this House, shares the grief and the frustration of the families of the 43 Australian servicemen missing in action after the Korean War of 1950 to 1953. An official list of all missing in action was released in 1953. It was in fact published in the media of the day, and I have a copy of an article from the Sydney Morning Herald in mid-1953 which lists those missing in action under various categories, both Air Force and Army. It lists them as either confirmed POWs, confirmed killed, confirmed wounded, or believed POWs, believed killed, believed wounded. In fact, Flying Officer Gillen is listed on this as missing believed POW. Successive Australian governments have sought to ascertain the status of all 43 missing in action, but at the time the North Korean regime did not confirm their status. And I know successive Australian governments have continued to make inquiries. In fact, I instigated exhaustive inquiries through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department through the Defence Department of the US and South Korean governments, and I responded to the relative of Flying Officer Gillen, courtesy of your office, in writing in October of 2016 to confirm that no further information had been made available. The tragic truth is the only authority that would have more information, could have more information, is the North Korean regime. And we have very limited diplomatic engagement with North Korea, and that's been the case for some time. Nevertheless, our embassy in Seoul has continued to make representations to the North Korean government about our missing in action as recently as March of this year. The summit meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un and the declaration that was signed that specifically refers to the repatriation of the remains of POWs and missing in action does give us some hope that there will be a final resolution of the status of the Australian Defence servicemen. Our defence personnel remain in constant contact with our counterparts in the United States, and I personally raised this issue with the Acting Ambassador of the United States during the course of this week.
No, there are no supplementary questions under the standing orders. The member for Boothby.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the minister update the House on the importance of pursuing tax policies that support aspirational Australians, including in my electorate of Boothby? Is the minister aware of any threats posed by different approaches?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for Boothby for her question. She backs hard-working, aspirational Australians, and she does that because she supports a tax system that will see them rewarded for their hard work and effort and able to keep even more of their hard-earned income. Now, under our tax plan, under our government's tax plan, 94% of those people who are out there and earning money will pay no more than 32.5 cents in the dollar when our plan is fully implemented. Now, I have noticed that there are those opposite who love to talk a lot about equity. I know it's not convenient for those opposite, but under the government's plan, those who are in the top tax bracket will pay a higher share of taxes than they do now under our plan. Yet, when Labor thinks about equity and when they think about retirees, what do? they decide instead to implement a mega retiree tax, and it is aimed at precisely those people who can least afford it. Under their cash grab, and let me just give an example, Joan, a self-funded retiree who earns a very modest $20,000 a year, including $9,800 in cash dividends and $4,200 worth of franking credits from her shares, she will see, under their mega retiree tax, every single one of her credits ripped off her, every single one, and it is courtesy of you-know-who, the Leader of the Opposition. Now, let's contrast that with William. William is a very high-income earner. Perhaps he's a union boss. He earns around $250,000 a year. He has exactly the same dividends from holding exactly the same set of shares and the exact same company as Joan does. And he gets the exact same franking credits. But guess what? Under this example, under William, is he going to be able to keep those franking credits? Well, of course he is. He's able to utilise that. You know, this mega retirees tax is not aimed at the top end of town. He does not lose a single thing, whereas Joan loses every single cent. The Leader of the Opposition likes to talk a big game when he talks about equity and the taxation system. He likes to claim that he protects those who are vulnerable and weak, yet he is the one who has his hand in the pockets of all the grandfathers of Australia. He's the one who's got his hand in the handbags of all of the grandmothers in Australia, because he is the one who would hit them with a very high tax. He is the one who would threaten their retirement and their security. He is so shifty, he cannot be trusted, and the Australian people know better.
The member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister confirm that under his tax scheme, a telco executive from Sydney's Upper North Shore earning $1 million a year gets a tax cut of over $7,000, but a shop assistant from Western Sydney selling phone plans gets a tax cut of just $10 a week? Is this why the Prime Minister is telling working Australians who are doing it tough to just get a better job?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the tax relief depends on a person's income, and indeed it would apply to a lawyer working for a large telco as well. It would. They're well paid as well. Mr Speaker, what the honourable member is trying to argue is that the tax in personal income tax reform is lacking in equity, and yet, under our plan, by 24-25, not only will 94% of Australians pay no more than 32.5 cents on every dollar, any dollar they earn over $41,000 until they get to $200,000, when the 45-cent tax rate comes in, but taxpayers earning in the over $200,000, paying 45 cents tax, plus of course the Medicare levy, they will constitute a larger share of the overall number of taxpayers and a substantially larger share of the total personal income tax receipts. So all of those people, all of those police sergeants and police inspectors, all of those people who are headmistresses and headmasters of schools around the country that are earning incomes around that level, as they will be by 24-25, those people earning above $125,000, some of them over $200,000, those people will be contributing more tax, more of the tax take than they are today. So, on any test, our reform is fair. It results in a flatter income tax system that encourages aspiration and incentive and enterprise, and that's the big difference. We are inspired by the aspiration of Australians. The Labor Party is mystified by it.
The member for COWPER.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. would the minister update the House on the current economic and political situation in Venezuela? And is the minister aware of any alternative views on this situation?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for COWPER for his question. And the Australian government is deeply concerned at the deteriorating political and economic situation in Venezuela, which was one of the richest countries in Latin America until it turned to socialism in 1999. The government then embraced anti-private sector policies. They spent recklessly. They racked up huge amounts of debt. And today the IMF has noted that the GDP of Venezuela has halved over recent years. It is predicted to fall a further 15%. Unemployment is currently at 30%, and hyperinflation is running at 13,000%. Mr Speaker, the currency has been devalued by 99.9%. There is massive starvation across Venezuela. The hospitals are overcrowded. Sickness is rife. Malaria has emerged after being eradicated years ago. Mr Speaker, the homicide rate is one of the highest in the world. There is violence and intimidation against critics of the government, and the human rights abuses are widespread. So, Mr Speaker,
Member for Bruce is warned.
imagine my surprise when I received a letter from the CFMEU urging me to publicly applaud the recent corrupt election of this brutal regime in Venezuela. The CFMEU
Members on both sides
holds up as an exemplar of governance the corrupt regime of Venezuela. Now, this is the same CFMEU that is the principal supporter of the Leader of the Opposition. This is the same CFMEU that is the major benefactor of the Leader of the Opposition. The same CFMEU that are part of the close advisory circle of the Leader of the Opposition. And Venezuela is their idea of a democracy to be applauded by the Australian government. Well, I tell you, Mr Speaker, the Turnbull government will continue to produce policies that build a stronger economy, that build more jobs, and that ensures we have a safer environment, that the Australian people are kept safe and secure. And we will do all we can to ensure that the CFMEU and its political arm, the Australian Labor Party, never wreak a Venezuelan nightmare on this country. I table the letter. Oh, by the way, the letter, of course, is copied to the Queen of Aspiration, the member for Sydney.
Members on both sides. The member for Gellibrand and the member for Barton will cease interjecting. I remind the member for Cowan that she's already been warned. And I also remind members interjecting while I'm addressing the chamber is highly disorderly and leads to an immediate suspension. The member for Ballarat has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that he's dealing with one nation so that an investment banker in a harbourside mansion earning $1 million will get a tax cut of $7,000, but a nurse in Caboolture will get a tax cut of only $10 a week? Is this why this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister is telling working Australians who are doing it tough to just get a better job?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I was very pleased to meet today a leadership group from Ballarat. They were here. They come here every year. They're inspiring people. They're in the gallery. Oh, good on you. Great to see you. Now, these young men and women came here as part of their leadership program to learn about the importance of leadership and values. And I can't say, Mr Speaker, how disappointed they would be to hear their federal member misrepresent what was said in this House, because they know very well that what leaders do is tell the truth, and what the honourable member did was not tell the truth, and she knows that. The only party in this place that believes it knows better than workers, whatever their occupation and whatever their pay scale, is the Labor Party. We know that our job is to enable Australians to do their best. That's our job, to dream their dreams and do all they can to realise them, to aspire as they wish and work hard to meet and reach those aspirations. The only people for whom aspiration is a mystery, the only people who want to keep 60-year-olds in their place and think they're too old to earn more money or get a promotion or do anything else, are these smug young men and women on the Labor side. Let me tell you, Mr Speaker, I reckon the young leaders from Ballarat have got more integrity and more character than has been shown by their federal member today.
The member for Murray.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industries, representing the Minister for Jobs and Innovation. Will the Minister update the House on how sound management of the economy and the budget creates jobs and growth in the economy, allowing the government to deliver the essential services expected by the Australian people? Are there different approaches that would achieve the same outcome?
The Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Jobs and Innovation.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Murray for his question. And I can tell the member for Murray that because of the government's economic and budgetary management, Mr Speaker, we've been able to create 1 million new jobs in Australia since we were elected in 2013. Because of our good economic management and our budgetary management, we've picked the economy up off the mat and we've got it moving again. We've got it growing again. Because of our economic management and our good budgetary management, we're able to invest more in health, in education, in life-saving medicines, in national security. Only because of what this government's been able to achieve in good economic management can we afford a $200 billion build-up of our military capability in the next 10 years, the largest in our peacetime history, Mr Speaker. But the other thing that we can afford, because of the budgetary management of the Treasurer, because revenues are growing, because the economies are growing, we're able to give hard-working Australian families $140 billion of tax cuts. We're able to give them back their own money, Mr Speaker, and that's what it is. It's their own money. On the other hand, Labor wants to give them either $70 billion or nothing. $70 billion or nothing versus $140 billion from this government, Mr Speaker. It's not enough. It's not enough, Mr Speaker, that they're belting retirees and pensioners who've worked hard all their lives to prepare for their retirement, or if their pensioners have put a little bit aside to be able to ensure they can afford a few of the nicer things in life. The Labor Party are belting retirees and pensioners, but now they want to stop hard-working Australian families on incomes like $90,000 from getting tax cuts, Mr Speaker, because they describe those people as rich. Apparently, if you are on $90,000, you are a rich Australian, Mr Speaker. Now, that is so, frankly, ludicrous that nobody would believe it. But that's what Labor wants people to believe, Mr Speaker. So Labor, they're so pleased with themselves on the other side of the House. They're so narcissistic, Mr Speaker, that they think they know better. They know better than the Australian public about how to spend their money. I mean, nothing could be starker in terms of the differences at the next election, Mr Speaker. At the next election, people will have a choice between whether they vote for a party that understands it's their money and wants to give their money back to them in tax cuts versus a party that think they know better how to spend the Australian public's money, think they know better about taking money away from Australians and making their decisions for them. One of the reasons we're Liberals and Nationals is because we believe that individuals should make their own decisions about how they spend their money. And tax cuts are giving back to the people the power to make their own decisions about their lives and the lives of their children. And that's why we'll win the next election and the Leader of the Opposition will lose it.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What policy commitments or undertakings has the government given to One Nation in return for their 2 votes in the Senate today?
The Prime Minister has the
Thank
floor.
you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and understand his interest in ensuring that the bill that he voted for when it was last in the House of Representatives should pass the Senate. And I can just say to him, Mr Speaker, it'll come back from the Senate amended, and we'll be voting to send it straight back. And so there's the opportunity for him to show a consistency, a steadfast commitment to push aside the mystification of the member for Sydney and vote for that bill and ensure that Australians get a fairer tax system.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. I'll take a point of order. Yes, the Manager of Opposition
Mr Speaker,
Business.
you have previously requested that for the first minute we don't take points of order on the basis that there is time for a preamble. Given that the Prime Minister is not even using that time to say anything relevant to the question at all, at what point does the Prime Minister become relevant?
Well, I'll tell you, the Manager of Opposition Business can resume his seat. I mean, he asked a question about the tax bill that's before the Senate, and the Prime Minister certainly in the preamble addressed that. And as I've said before, the 3 minutes is a maximum amount. It's a limit. It's not mandated that the Prime Minister use all of that time. It's certainly not mandated that the Prime Minister answer the question in the way the Manager of Opposition Business desires. He was relevant to the question, and he wrapped up within 50 seconds. And you and I have now spent more time talking about it than he did answering it. So we'll move to the next question. The member for MALLEE.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the government is investing in the infrastructure needed to increase productivity and create local jobs, including in the great electorate of MALLEE? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any roadblocks to this success?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, when the regions are strong, so too is our nation. And I thank the member for MALLEE for his question, for his advocacy for his great electorate. And certainly he knows that the Liberals and Nationals have an ongoing commitment to deliver for regional Australia, especially in regional Victoria. I'm proud to be part of this government, Mr Speaker, which is driven to deliver for our nation's regions. The home of our farmers, our resources, those food and fibre producers, Mr Speaker, some of the hardest working people in Australia. And that's why we turn up on this side every day to fight for the regions so that they can get their fair share, their share of the pie, to fight for hard-working Australians so they can keep more of their money in their pockets and fight for the essential services that Australians need, want, demand and expect. And when you've got a strong economy, you can build the road and rail and the infrastructure that our country needs. We also know that not all the best ideas come from Canberra, and that's why every chance that we get, we're out on the road talking to people, more importantly listening to people. And I was so pleased to be with the Prime Minister and the Minister for Agriculture on our drought tour just the other day, listening to people, making sure that we heard their issues, their concerns. We heard from farmers who are doing it tough in the member for Parkes electorate and the member for Maranoa's electorate as well. But it's not only the farmers, it's the flow-on effect to those small businesses that do it tough, the machinery and equipment dealers, the small cafe feeling the pressure, feeling the pinch as the disposable income dries up due to the prolonged dry spell. But we're building the infrastructure that our local communities need. We're building for the future projects such as the $20 million for the Calder and Western Highway upgrades, $10 million upgrading the regional airport at Mildura in the member for Mallee's electorate, and $3 million modernisation of water infrastructure in Victoria's Sunraysia region near Mildura. Important projects, but it's also about delivering the sort of infrastructure that we need in Braddon, local infrastructure that we need in Braddon. $400 million, such as upgrading roads throughout Tasmania, including in the electorate of Braddon, and the almost $8 million set aside to upgrade highways. We've invested more than $871,000 in bridge replacements in Braddon.
We've invested more than $18 million through programs including the Regional Jobs and Investment Package and Building Better Regions Fund in Braddon. Compare and contrast this to Labor. Labor is a roadblock to growth. It is a roadblock to building the infrastructure that families, that farmers, that businesses need in Braddon, in Longman, elsewhere. It's a roadblock to jobs, not just today's jobs, but jobs for our children and our children's children. I urge all Australians, especially in Braddon, to consider the risks of those two, Shadow Minister, to consider the risks of sending another roadblock to Canberra.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for McMahon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, what is the median personal income in Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll take that question on notice, but what I will. But it is certainly well below. It's certainly well below the average full-time weekly earnings, because many Australians are working part-time and are therefore on lower earnings. But rather than make an attempt to pick a number, I will take that on notice and I'll come back to the honourable member on it.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of a strong and united approach to combating the scourge of people smuggling? Is the minister aware of any other approaches which pose threats to Australia's border security?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member very much for his question and recognise that work that he does, particularly in Western Australia. It's very important to Western Australia because West Australians, like all Australians, recognise that we have a vulnerability with people coming from Indonesia at the hands of people smugglers. The reality is, Mr Speaker, there are 14,000 people in Indonesia right now waiting to get onto boats. We know that the people smugglers are looking very carefully at this election. If I was a people smuggler in Indonesia, I'd be getting down to Sportsbet in Jakarta, putting as much money as you can on the Labor Party getting into government. I suspect that's what they're counting on, Mr Speaker, because if Labor gets back into power, the boats restart. Mr Speaker, that is the bottom line. You're seeing images out of the United States at the moment with kids in detention. You see the tragedy of people drowning on the Mediterranean, hundreds of thousands of people trying to move into Europe. Don't forget, that's exactly the scenes that we saw on our television screens only a few years ago, and yet, for over 1,400 days, because of the policies of this government, we have not had a child drown at sea. 1,200 people drowned at sea under Labor. And, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party wants to undo the policies that have resulted in stopping of the boats. Now, Mr Speaker, we've heard from every Labor member about how they want to dismantle—
The Minister will just pause for a second. The member for Eden-Monaro and the member for McKellar will continue their conversation outside the chamber. They'll both leave under 94A. The Minister has the call.
So, Mr Speaker, we have heard from every Labor member about their plan to undo the policies that we have if they get back into government. And I noticed some comments from the Labor member for Braddon, Justine Key, and she said on turnbacks, Mr Speaker, it's interesting when you look at some of the comments that they've made, because she is a very good supporter, she says, and she agrees with the position of Albo, the member for Greenway.
The Minister will refer to members by their correct
That was a
titles.
direct quote, Mr Speaker, my apologies. But
that doesn't excuse
on
it.
turnbacks, Ms Key says, I don't support it. And she says, and this is a direct quote, Mr Speaker, with Albo on this, every person you look at on the front bench, Mr Speaker, has been weak on border protection in opposition and in government. Those people that would sit around the National Security Committee, if you have a look at them one by one, they are as weak as water. It's 700 days. We've not even had a question from the Shadow Minister on boats. It's interesting. They sedate him when he comes in here. On the quarter hour, his head turns from 10 to 2 and turns back again on the next quarter hour, Mr Speaker. The fact is they don't want to talk about boats because they are completely disastrous when it comes to boat policy, and the Australian public should never, ever forget it.
The member for Griffith.
Mr Speaker, my questions to the Prime Minister. Can this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister confirm he's dealing with one nation so that a banker from Clayfield earning $1 million gets a tax cut of over $7,000 a year, their bank gets a company tax cut with $17 billion going to the big banks, but a bartender from Cairns gets a tax cut of only $10 a week?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The personal tax plan we announced in the budget benefits all Australians who are working and paying tax. And there's some data released today by the Australian Bureau of Statistics which sets out who pays tax in this country and how that supports all Australians around the country. 20% of households with the lowest private income in this country receive 57% of the cash benefits and 28% of the benefits in kind, while paying 5% of the taxes. The top 20% of private income households received 3% of cash benefits, 14% of the benefits in kind, and paid half of, that is 50% of total taxes in this country, Mr Speaker. So we have a progressive tax system in this country which ensures that those who have done better in life pay higher average rates of taxes and indeed higher marginal rates of taxes, and they bear the majority burden of the tax burden in this country. And the question for the Labor Party is, how much more do you want people to pay in tax? I mean, when is too much tax ever enough for the Labor Party? It's never enough, because there's never too much spending, which is too much for the Labor Party, and that's why they cannot be trusted to manage a budget or oversee an economy or to ensure a stronger economy that guarantees the essential services that the very people that the member was asking about rely on. Those people that the member was asking about depend on a stronger economy to ensure they can get the services that they rely on. And that stronger economy is driven by people who earn, who start businesses, who have success, and the Labor Party wants to set them up as the problem. They have set aspiration as the problem with Australia and success as the reason why Australia is failing on their terms, Mr Speaker. But what we've had from the Labor Party just in the last 24 hours is the Shadow Treasurer. His policy of his own personal tax plan yesterday didn't last 24 hours. They've had 4 positions since the budget on the personal tax plan. First they agreed with stage 1 only, and then they came in here and voted for the whole package. Yesterday he said, he stood up there proudly with the Leader of the Opposition and said, "We are only supporting stage 1 again." And then up in the Senate, the Labor Party has said they're going to only remove stage 3. Now, this bloke cannot keep a position from one day to the next, Mr Speaker. And we know the same thing when it comes to corporate tax. He wrote about how it's so important for companies to have business taxes that are competitive, but when he's asked to do for it and when he's asked to vote for it, he's not up to the task. This is a Shadow Treasurer that does not have the ticker to run a stronger economy, Mr Speaker, or manage a budget or hold a position on tax from one day to the next. And there's a simple reason. His new mentor on economic policy is the member for Sydney.
The member for Bonner has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the minister update the House on how the government's action to reduce power prices will benefit families and local businesses in my electorate of Bonner and across south-east Queensland? Is the minister aware of any different proposals?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Bonner for his question. And under the coalition, reducing power prices isn't merely an aspiration, it's actually a reality, Mr Speaker. It's actually a reality because the big 3 in Queensland, New South Wales and South Australia recently reduced their prices, Mr Speaker. That is in stark contrast to what happened when the Labor Party were last in office, when power prices doubled and they went up each and every year, Mr Speaker. And this reduction in power prices is good news. Good news for the 12,000 small businesses in Longman, Mr Speaker. Good news for the 15,000 19,000 small businesses in the seat of Bonner, Mr Speaker, and good news for the 19,000 small businesses in Mayo, Mr Speaker. And if you are a small business in Brisbane, you can see a saving of up to $470 a year, Mr Speaker. And over 1 million households across south-east Queensland will actually get a saving now on their power bill as a result of these announcements, Mr Speaker. Now, this is a positive set of numbers, and we know that Labor aren't too good at their numbers, Mr Speaker, The member for Greenway doesn't quite have them, Mr Speaker. He doesn't quite have them. The member for Port Adelaide didn't quite get them, Mr Speaker. And the member for Lily, after 6 budget blowouts, finally got the numbers, Mr Speaker. He finally got the numbers. Now, Mr Speaker, I'll tell you about another set of numbers. When Labor was last in office, power prices went up by 101%, Mr Speaker. Now Labor is promising a 50% reckless renewable energy target, Mr Speaker, and a 45% emissions reduction target, which will only do one thing to your power bills, Mr Speaker: send them up, Mr Speaker. Under the coalition, you'll always pay less for your power than under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. If you're a manufacturer, working in a manufacturing business, the Labor Party don't care about your job, Mr Speaker. If you're a family, they don't care about your power bill, Mr Speaker. We have a plan. We have a plan to lower your power bills, to create a more reliable system, in stark contrast to the reckless Labor renewable energy targets, which will only send your power bills up, Mr Speaker.
That's right. Good answer. The member for Franklin.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is this snobbish Prime Minister telling workers, Australians, to get a better job instead of supporting Labor's plan to give 39,000 people in Braddon who earn less than $125,000, including aged care workers, a tax cut of up to $928 a year, almost double the tax cut they'll get from this government?
I'm not going to call the Prime Minister immediately. I'm going to address an issue with this question, indeed a number of questions that's been grating with me for several days now, and that is the use of these abusive taglines that are in them. It leads to a— I'll address the chamber without— The member for Hotham was reflecting on me, in which case she can come to the dispatch box and withdraw.
I withdraw, Speaker. My apologies.
I just make clear I'm going to address the House without interjection. This, of course, leads to a situation best summed up by the member for Jagga-Jagga's question in the last sitting week, where the Prime Minister was given a huge character assessment that wasn't a question and that's followed in questions since, which then led to the Prime Minister naturally responding to what was part of the 30-second statement and question, with the member for Jagga-Jagga then complaining about the response. As I pointed out, there was no way I was going to allow that question to be asked and then curtail the answer. My personal view is this demeans the House because it leads to very aggressive questions that have statements in them that simply aren't questions. And that particular question has taken it, I think, to a new low. Now, I'm just flagging with the House. I'm not happy with how this goes. I've never wanted to curtail debate, but the 30-second time limit is for questions. I've allowed preambles, but if it's going to end up leading down this path, I'm flagging now. I'll be taking a different approach. Happy to hear on a point of order, and then I'm going to—
I'm simply wanting just to clarify, for the purposes of question time preparation, whether the ruling you've just gone to goes only to questions or also to the words that are used in answers.
Well, the point I'm making is twofold. The 30 seconds is for questions. Okay. I've allowed preambles, but if the preambles are becoming abusive and that then leads to a response in the answer, that's the point I'm making. No, well, I'll tell you what, don't. Just sit down for a second. No, members on my right, because I've said members on my right will cease interjecting. I've just indicated to the House I'm uncomfortable with how this is going. I'm not making a ruling. I've just indicated I'm uncomfortable with how it's going. And if it keeps proceeding down this path, the parliament will be demeaned and the public, rightly, will be quite dissatisfied. Now, that question has a particular word in it that was an interjection used yesterday. And if we're going to go down that path, I'm just saying I will end up taking action. I would have thought, having made the statement I've just made, I would hope it's not beyond members to take some corrective action themselves. I'm monitoring the situation. On this occasion, I'll call the Prime Minister.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, I'll take the opportunity from the question to refer to some important benefits that will flow to the residents and constituents in Braddon from the government's economic plan. Mr Speaker, there are 39,300 taxpayers in Braddon who will benefit from the 1st of July this year from our personal income tax plan, with around 14,600 who will receive the full $530. But, Mr Speaker, that is not all. There will be, if were Labor to be able to impose its retiree tax, grabbing back the franking credits that retirees are able to enjoy under a law that is fair and has had bipartisan support from the time—
Member for Gellibrand. Member for Gellibrand will cease interjecting.
Well, Mr Speaker—
Member for Gellibrand, if he wants to say anything, he'll have to get himself a question, frankly. The Prime Minister has the call. Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, this is the modern Labor Party. They're not even capable of running an effective class war. So this is what they want to do. This is what they want to do on the retiree tax. So if you are a wealthy investor and you've got lots of investments and you get some franking credits from your listed stocks, you can use those franking credits to offset your other tax liabilities. You can do that. They've gone the honourable member opposite. He's very happy with that. But he's a very confused class warrior, because if, on the other hand, you are a retiree of modest means, you are not paying tax, you have a superannuation fund, it's a retirement account, it's not paying tax because of those superannuation rules, and you get some dividends with those franking credits, you don't have other tax liabilities to offset them against. So from around 2000, from the year 2000, with bipartisan support, it was Labor policy as well as coalition policy, people in that situation are able to get the tax credit refunded. And that has been fair, it's been obvious, but what the member for Gellibrand wants to do, and his leader and their whole team, they want to cut retirees' incomes by 20%, 28%, as one lady in her 80s told me, right up to 30%. So how many people are there in Braddon that are going to be hit by that? 3,534. 3,534. And, Mr Speaker, in terms of company tax, you know, Tasmania's going through strong economy. There are over 8,000 businesses in Braddon.
Has concluded. Unless the opposition leader is seeking to call to move a motion, the call's to my right. The member for PETRIE has the
thanks,
call.
Mr Speaker. My question's to the Health Minister. Will the Health Minister please update the House on how a stronger economy enables the government to deliver life-changing support services for drug addiction to those living in Redcliffe and Caboolture? Is the Minister aware of any alternative attitudes to the funding of health services in Queensland?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for PETRIE for his question. He comes to this place as somebody who ran a successful small business. And one of the things he knows is that in order to run a successful economy, as well as a successful small business, you need a plan.
Member for Macarthur.
And that's a plan which is about ensuring that we have lower costs and the capacity to invest. And that plan, which this government has, allowed us to help the country deliver an extra 1 million jobs. And those 1 million jobs have allowed us to ensure that we are able to guarantee the essential services that matter to all Australians. Essential services such as record funding for Medicare, for hospitals, for mental health and for aged care. But one of his particular passions is also about ensuring that we have adequate support and real and powerful support for drug and alcohol dependency. In his own electorate, he's been a powerful and unstinting advocate for the Redcliffe PCYC, helping to secure a $450,000 upgrade to their services, and only recently a new local drug and alcohol team. But he also asks about Caboolture, because only recently I visited Caboolture and I was there with our candidate, Trevor Ruthenberg, for the seat of Longman. Big Trev, absolutely. Big Trev has the heart of a lion, and one of his passions is also to ensure that there is drug and alcohol treatment for the people of Caboolture who need that additional support according to the needs assessment of the Primary Health Network. And so whilst we were there, we outlined additional funding of $11 million for Lives Lived Well. And that funding goes to residential care and beds, but also to detox and to recovery and day services. And the reason why we did that is the very testimonial that I received today from one of the clients of Lives Lived Well, Debbie, who has had a drug and alcohol problem. And her quote is, "After seeing Lives Lived Well for the past 2 months, I have a better understanding of why I was using ice, and I've got control back over my life. Now I can focus again. I've been able to get a job and get back into my hobbies." That's what we're supporting. That's what matters on the ground. That's what Big Trev is supporting. That's what the coalition is fighting for in Longman. But what that compares with is what Queensland Labor has done. Whilst we've been adding to the Brisbane Metro North $120 million in the last full year to that area for hospital funding, Queensland Labor has cut $20 million from the Brisbane Metro North. And why? Because they can't manage the economy. And if you can't manage the economy—
The minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister on one hand telling working Australians to get a better job, but on the other hand blocking Labor's plan to give the 63,000 people in Longman who earn less than $125,000, and that includes aged care workers, a tax cut of up to $928 a year? Why is the Prime Minister blocking an income tax plan which will be double the tax cut that the government's currently offering people?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party may be mystified by aspiration, but nobody is mystified by the way in which the Leader of the Opposition again and again misleads the House. I said no such thing. You know that very well.
Members on my left.
And just because you repeat a falsehood does not make it true. Australians, whether they work in aged care, whether they work in manufacturing, whether they work in agriculture, are entitled to aspire to do whatever they want to do. They're entitled to aspire to better paid jobs, to different jobs, to promotions. They're entitled to aspire, to dream, and our job as the government, and I would say the parliament, is to do everything we can to enable them to realise those aspirations. But the Labor Party stands in the way of those aspirations. They want those workers and particularly those that are getting on a bit in years, those 60-year-olds, yes, they've got to stay put, don't they? They can't aspire to anything. Does not the patronising smugness, the slimy insinuation about older Australians, it's sickening, and it would embarrass and does embarrass the men and women who were the leaders of the Labor Party in years gone by. No doubt, we don't have to doubt why Paul Keating said Labor is failing because it is not able to connect to aspirational Australians, and the reason why is smug in those big government salaries. The Labor Party is mystified by the way in which millions of Australians want to get ahead, and they want to keep them where in their place.
The member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the minister update the House on the importance of the government's tax relief plan to reward aspiration to work, save and invest? Is the minister mystified by other approaches to tax relief?
Good question. The Minister for Trade and Investment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for his question, because the Coalition's budget plan for immediate and sustained tax relief is consistent with the global push for lower, flatter taxes for individuals and pro-investment tax policies for business. Because the simple fact is, Mr Speaker, that you cannot hit the Australian economy with $200 billion tax slug, as Labor wants to do, and expect businesses and households to remain indifferent to that extra tax slug. And in fact, to encourage and reward hard-working Australians, we're making income tax lower, fairer and simpler. And to encourage and reward business investment, we want to make sure that we make our tax system internationally competitive. And under our plan, Australians who aspire to work hard, take extra shifts or earn pay rises or promotions will be encouraged and rewarded. And as Investment Minister, Mr Speaker, I welcome lower company tax and lower, flatter personal taxes for our most productive and talented workers and entrepreneurs. And we'll let them keep more of the money that they make, because on this side of the House we absolutely respect and reward those who want to do their best and have aspiration. So the member asked, am I mystified by alternative approaches? Well, absolutely I am mystified, because we continue to see the Australian Labor Party attack the aspiration of people. Now the question is, Mr Speaker, why is it that Labor is so mystified by aspiration? Why is it that Labor has a war on ambition? And I think it comes down to the Leader of the Opposition, because he doesn't embody aspiration and he doesn't embody ambition. In fact, the vast bulk of them don't embody those traits. But there is one among them who does embody aspiration. There is one among them who does embody a bit of ambition. And the question is, who would it be? Who has those traits? Who is it that has ambition? Who has aspiration? That's the question. Well, who could it be?
The minister knows the rules on crops.
Who, me? The member for Greenway can mouth the words. Who, me? I mean, what we know, Mr Speaker, and there was a fascinating article to read, right from the very first sentence through to the very last sentence. The first sentence says, Anthony Albanese has misplaced his wallet. Well, I tell you what, if there's a political party to misplace your wallet in, it's in the Australian Labor Party. But it goes all the way through to the end, where it says in the final sentence, the journalist says, I pay our bill, and Albo heads off down Marrickville Road. Well, isn't that just a summation of the Australian Labor Party? Because it's going to be every other Australian that pays that $200 billion bill that the Australian Labor Party is going to levy on the lot of us.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister proud that he is the first Prime Minister in Australian history to unite the government, Catholic and independent school sectors against his policies? Why is this Prime Minister so devoid of judgment that he ignored the people who teach our kids when they told him that his school's funding regime was profoundly flawed?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy, representing the Minister for Education.
a question, and I'm pleased to inform her that under the Turnbull government's education reforms, that the schools in her electorate will on average be $2.5 million better off, Mr Speaker, and that the Burke Street Public School in her electorate will see a 51.4% increase over the decade, Mr Speaker. That is a result of the Turnbull government's reforms. And the member for Maribyrnong, the Leader of the Opposition, he has 54 schools in his electorate, 30,000 students, and every school will get more money under the Turnbull government's reforms, Mr Speaker, an average of over $7.2 million extra for schools in Maribyrnong, Mr Speaker. So the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Sydney should know that when it comes to education, we have ended the 27 special deals, Mr Speaker. We've ended the 27 special deals and we've put in place a fully funded improvement to the education funding for Australian students. More than $20 billion extra, Mr Speaker. And when it comes to the seat of Longman, the Queensland Catholic Education Commission will see its funding increase from just over $9,000 to just over $12,000 per student over the decade, a 36.5% increase, Mr Speaker. When it comes to the seat of Braddon, the Tasmanian Catholic Education Office will see their funding per student go from $10,000, over $10,000 per student, to over $15,000 per student over the decade, an increase of 44%, Mr Speaker. And in the electorate of Mayo, the Catholic education South Australian school system will see its funding going from over $9,000 a student today to well over $12,000 a student within the decade, a nearly 40% increase. So, Mr Speaker, don't look at what Labor says, look at what Labor does. They had 27 special deals. The Turnbull government is increasing funding for school students across the country and across all sectors.
Yeah. The member for Calare.
My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the minister update the House on measures the government is taking to support farmers in financial hardship during drought, including in the electorate of Calare? And are there any alternate proposals that the minister is aware of?
The Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Calare for his question, because he knows better than anyone the impacts this drought is having on his farming constituency. And in fact, I was only with him last month with a group of farmers in a paddock of wheat that had just been planted and was doing it pretty tough. It needed some rain. But I'm also proud that only a couple of weeks ago the Prime Minister, myself, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Regional Development went out across farms across New South Wales and Queensland, and Narromine and Trangie. Up into my electorate, we've had drought for 7 years in places like Blackall and Charleville, and then up into Kennedy, a place called Boulia. What we did is we sat at farmers' kitchen table and we listened. We listened to them. And yesterday we acted. Yesterday we acted as a government, because the common theme that we heard wherever we went was the farm household assistance was important to those farmers. It was putting bread and butter on farmers' kitchen table, putting fuel in the car to be able to send their kids into sport of the weekend. But it goes further than that. It went further than that, because what it also does is it gives them the ability to go and get a skill, to diversify, to get a job in town, to be able to drive a forklift, to be able to diversify their income, to get an income stream in town. This is an important issue for those farmers. But above and beyond that, we've gone deeper. We've gone deeper than that. We've invested another $20 million into the Rural Financial Counselling Service. And what we're doing with these is we're putting these counsellors in front of these farmers, giving them caseworkers to get underneath the bonnet of their business, to be able to help them to understand whether they need to change their business. And in fact, sometimes they'll have to have a hard conversation. And sometimes people won't come out the other end. But you know what? This is about giving them the time to make those decisions with dignity and pride. That's what we're about. It's about making sure we understand what we are trying to do, making sure that we build a resilient agriculture sector, because the good times are still to come. When the rain comes, the regional communities that support agriculture will thrive. But we need to make sure that we set the environment around our farmers to be able to do that. But above all that, and above all the financial assistance we're going to give to our farmers, one of the biggest investments that we announced while we were out there was a further $2 million to online psychological services. Because I can tell you, from those people that I represent that have been in drought for 7 years, they're mentally fatigued. They're buggered. They've had a gutful, and they don't know how they're going to get on. And you know what? It's important. It's important that they have the resilience, that we invest in them and their resilience. But above all, we need to remove the stigma that if you do have a mental illness, it's okay to reach out for help. It's okay to ask for help, and it's beholden on each and every one of us that if we're okay, to reach out to one another and ask, are you okay? That's what this government's about. It's not just financial. It's making sure that those regional communities that are doing it tough understand that when the good times come, that we'll be there to help them take advantage of it.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll add to an answer. The median of all wages is $53,000 a year, whereas as I foreshadowed, the average weekly ordinary time earnings is currently stated by the ABS to be $81,640. And thank the honourable member for his inquiry, and on that note ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the